G'day guys, you're back with MiracleMAX. It's a bit of a warm one today, but what do we have in the workshop? It's a Toyota Rav4 2.5 litre 2014 and it will not start. What's wrong with it? Let's check it out. The owner of this particular vehicle is a regular customer of mine, so when they rang up at a little past 10 the other night, I decided to go down and help them out. They were stuck outside a shopping centre and it wouldn't start, so I went down and spent a little bit of time trying to diagnose it with the limited tools that I took with me. It wouldn't start, so it got towed back to the workshop. I went to start it the next day and, hey presto, the thing started. Wouldn't you know it? Makes it very hard to diagnose when there's nothing to find. I've got a few clues as to what it might be, so I'll take you along for the ride and see if we can figure it out together. When it stalled, the customer noted these things come up on the dash: engine oil pressure low and high transmission fluid temperature. Now, I've done some research on these things and can't really find too much information, but let's start with the basics as per usual. What do we need to make this thing go? We need air, fuel and spark. So let's see what we've got. First things first, I do want to confirm that it doesn't start. Yes, good. So using the new G-Scan 3 that I've got here, you can see I've done a full system search. It lists it as a startability malfunction, and that's all I could find the other night when I was trying to diagnose it on the street. The problem is with this, it's really not much help. It's saying it had trouble starting. Helpful one, Louise. Seriously? There's no help in that fault code whatsoever. It could be spark, it could be all sorts of things. This is the only fault code that is across the board. Not much help. Okay, where to next? Let's start with the basics. Just focusing on one ignition coil at the moment. I happen to have a spare ignition coil, a Toyota one. It's a Denso style that will actually clip straight in here. And this is a great idea, or a quick test to see if it's actually going to work. So I'll disconnect that fella there. Yeah, come on bloke. Yeah, there we go. And of course I'll need to earth that out somewhere, won't I? Where are you? There. I'll need to earth that out somewhere. So I'll just put that on a good earth point nearby. Doesn't matter what it is. And I'll get you guys focused on that to see if you can see if there's a spark or not. A little bit jumpy, but I guess you saw the spark. I couldn't quite see it while I was cranking. You say, okay Max, well I don't have a spare ignition coil. What testing can I do? I'll give you a bit of a heads up on some different methods. Once that circuit is open, then the coil will go from the primary to the secondary and create that spark, that high voltage which creates the spark. So this one here should be 0 and we should get frequency as soon as I crank it. Let's have a look at that. And although there didn't appear to be much frequency happening, it was switching. This bloke over here, next one, over you go. That one should have 5 volts attached to it. And there we have our 5 volts. This is a bias voltage that is sent to the ECU, and that gets triggered by the spark or interrupted by the spark, and then that 5 volt change, I guess you could say, the frequency change goes from high down to low, so from 5 volts down to 0 volts. That goes back to the ECU, and this bloke says, yes, I did spark just like you asked me. So it's basically a feedback or a check for that particular coil, so the ECU can do misfire counts, etc. I'm just going to show you how that works with my little tiny oscilloscope. You know, I would love to own a Pico oscilloscope, but unfortunately the cupboard she be bare. As you know, I'm always trying to think outside of the box, come up with solutions to problems. I'd like to introduce to you the MiracleMAX Pico POV Pack. Pico POV Pack, you say? I'm interested. What is it? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me show you. So you know, for some time I've been using this cheap little one-channel oscilloscope. So how do you improve on that? Well, what you do is you give yourself 2 cheap single-channel oscilloscopes. Introducing to you the MiracleMAX 2-channel 2 oscilloscope. How's that going to help us with our diagnosis? Well, let me show you. Remember when I told you that there were two connections that we could check on our ignition coil to see if it was being fired by the ECU and the feedback circuit was correct or not. So as you can see here, I have one oscilloscope hooked up to my feedback circuit and the other one the triggering circuit, and of course the earths for those are over here. So let me show you what to expect. Remember, there was going to be 5 volts on one, and as it worked it would drop down to 0. The other one would start at 0 and go up to 5 volts. Let's have a look at our oscilloscopes and see if that works. The worst part about this Rav4 fault is that it's intermittent. So now the damn thing is running, but I'll give you an idea so you can see what a 4-wire ignition coil looks like. You can see the pattern here is starting high and being pulled down low, and this is for all cylinders, and that's why there's a lot more of them there. This one over here is low and it gets pulled high, and that's why there's only 1 or 2 of them, because I'm only doing one cylinder rather than this feedback circuit being connected in parallel. Therefore it's doing 4 at once. This one over here is only doing cylinder number 1. Now I probably won't be able to show you where I hook up to the injectors, because I'll show you where they're hidden. There's the front of the engine. We sneak down past here right at the back. Hang on folks. There's our injectors way back there. Alright, so that's this bloke here is number 2 injector. So what I'm going to do is look for power on one, which will be the yellow wire because they're all yellow, and the other one will be grey. So the grey will be the switching wire. That's the one I'm going to focus on for now. What I'm going to do is use one of my normal dressmaking pins and stick it into the grey wire, not the yellow wire. The yellow wire is the power. I want to see if it's being switched. I'm not going to worry about the power side of it for now, because the power is actually being interrupted by the ECU on the other end, and the injector coil is in the middle. So if I've got switching on this side, that must mean that the coil is actually continuous, or it's okay, or a complete circuit. This next test I'm going to do is using an LED test light, but the difference being is that we hook this bloke, which is normally on the ground, onto the positive side of the battery. What did I say? Positive side of the battery. And if I do that and hook this onto ground somewhere, I should get a green light. Should see that green light there? Green light, green light. Now what I'm going to do is just get an extension wire off the injector, the negative side of the injector, or the switch side of the injector, and the other end of my jump wire I'm just going to hook up to my test light here. I'll probably turn the light off for you so you can see it pulsing. I'll just put that there for you. Can you see that? I hope you can. Right, other end goes on to this fella down here. Okay, there we go. I'll just turn that light out for you, and hopefully if I zoom in, whoops, other way zoom, you should be able to see it pulse there when I crank it. Can you see that now? We now know that it has injector pulse and it has spark. I have no trouble with that. What else would be next? Well look, I'm going to head toward the fuel pump. I think that might be an option. Might need a wiring diagram at this point. One thing I have been concerned about was that message on the dash that said the oil pressure was low, engine oil pressure was low. So what I've done is I've hooked up my oil pressure gauge into where the sender unit normally goes, and that's the little fella there that I pulled out. And you know, I just want to check and see that the oil pressure is okay. Now it does tend to rattle at first start up, and I'm not going to get it hot right now, but let's just have a look and make sure, well, does it have any pressure at all? Before I get all excited, I should really start with the basics. So let's check the engine oil level, make sure that that's okay. You can see no problemo right here. So that's well within its limits. Considering it's done, I don't know, several thousand Ks since its last service. So, not concerned about the actual oil level itself. And it's gone up to, what's that, about 60 PSI, I guess, at idle when it's cold. Is that okay? And of course you should always do the check when it's hot, not necessarily when it's cold. But I'll let it run for a couple of minutes just to see how much it drops back. Well, it certainly has dropped back, hasn't it? And why is that? Well, the viscosity or the thickness of the oil is getting thinner. Therefore, that changes the pressure reading. But at the moment, look, I'm happy with that reading. It's certainly well above the specifications at the moment. I'm going to let it run longer, I was initially thinking that perhaps the reason that it's cutting out the engine is because the oil pressure is getting too low, and then the ECU cuts out either the ignition or the injection to protect the system itself. But at the moment, hey, look, the oil pressure is okay. The Rav4s do tend to have a bit of a problem with the sieve or the oil pickup in the sump. They do tend to gum up. Since I've been working on this car, I've been using full synthetic oil, and the lady is meticulous with her servicing. So I don't believe it's an issue now, but who knows what the servicing was like before she purchased it. According to the spec sheet here, it says oil pressure when the engine is warm at idle 4.4 psi. Man, that's low. That seems way low. Above 4,000 RPM at 38 psi or more. And well, have a look. If you have a look at the gauge, you can see it's roughly about 30 psi. Nothing wrong with that. So why is it cutting out? Why is it not starting on occasion? I don't believe it's an oil pressure issue. That certainly seems okay. I'll just have to wait for it to break down. What a pain in the neck. There's one other test that I want to do on the oil pressure sender just before I go any further to make sure that it's not breaking down under heat. So you can see we've got continuity here, and look, I don't know if it's going to play up or not. It's just what I want to try and do to see if there's a fault within the sender unit itself. That's about 2 psi there, so that's well below the limit, but I'll just see if that's going to make any difference or not. It seems to be holding, but yeah, proof of concept, I believe that it seems to be okay. I'll keep that in mind. Not saying it's an issue, but it's a test that I felt I had to do. Well, I'm just about to start the vehicle, and to be quite honest, I'm not overly concerned that I had to replace the oil and the filter. I was going to keep the oil, but I had a look at the service sticker and it was pretty much due for a service anyway, so oil and filter out here, new stuff. Hopefully we should be able to sort out that issue. I can't see any reason for it to have a low oil pressure symptom, and also the gauge is telling me that everything is honky-dory, so bit of a stretch of the imagination, this one. So new oil, new filter. I've started it and run it a few times and topped up my oil level as well. One thing that I have noticed, I've let it sit for 20 minutes or so. When it starts up now, it doesn't have that rattle that we heard before when it starts up. Check it out. You can see it's got oil pressure straight away, and it doesn't have that rattle when it starts up. Are we on a winner? I don't know. We might have sorted out the oil pressure issue, whatever that was. Perhaps the oil filter bypass valve was stuck or something along those lines. I'm not sure. But this non-starting issue, is it related? I'm just going to have to road test it again and again and again. I've spoken to the customer. They've given me permission to keep it for an extended period of time, and I've got a service to do on it anyway, so I might as well incorporate that at the same time. So, yeah, road test, road test, road test. Look, there seems to be so many different wiring diagrams for this particular vehicle, and none of them seem consistent. I've tried Auto Data, I've tried Haynes, and the best one, to be quite honest, I believe, is the actual owner's manual. Now, if you have a look here, there's several EFI relays. They call them fuses, but these are the relays themselves. And over here, it lists several of them together. Number 1, number 2, then it gives a list down here. It's all a bit confusing. But I'm looking for fuel pump. Notice that there, fuel pump. Now that has an asterisk with number 1 next to it, and I'll explain what that means. Over here, number 1 represents the 3ZRFE. We have a 2ARFE, so we need the asterisk with the number 2 on it. And if we search over here, we can see the number 2, and it's got fuel pump attached to it, which makes sense because that's actually feeding the airflow sensor, the fuel pump, and the rear O2 sensor, not the ignition system or the fuel injection system. It could be a faulty relay. I'll pop that out and have a look, but I'll show you what else I've been doing under the bonnet. Look, the only way I'm going to catch this vehicle out is to have gauges hooked up when it plays up, when it doesn't start. So I've got an oil pressure gauge over there, as you can see. I've had that on for some time. I'm going to leave that on, cable tied out the road of course, and over here I've just installed a fuel pressure gauge. So if my fuel pressure drops off for any reason, I'll be able to see that. So I'm going to leave them connected, cover them with rags and etc., and then drive around until it plays up. Then I'll be able to have some good data that I can see what's actually playing up at the time. This is the fuse box that's under the bonnet, right next to the ECU. Now this one here is that EFI relay number 2. So I'd like to pull that out and just have a quick peek at it, see if there's any issues with it. I've just got the relay under my digital microscope and I'm not sure how much you guys can see, but if you have a look here on the points, you see that little black mark there? That's on the relay section that moves. See that black spot there? I'm just wondering if that might be a cause for, you know, the relay not working or not contacting on occasion. So it might be worth replacing this relay simply because of the fact that it's an issue. You know, it's better to replace it. It's only a cheap item, and I can show the customer this as well and help them to appreciate why I've replaced it. I'm not replacing parts for no reason, but I might just take a photo of that. That way I can show the customer what the actual fault is. Another one on the list, I guess. Hopefully that's a bit of a direction anyway. Now that I've got my gauges hooked up, I can physically see what they're doing. I'll carry a spare relay with me when I go on a road test, and then that way if it does play up, then I can just replace the relay and see if that was actually the fault. You can see I've got my oil pressure gauge tied nicely into place. It's tucked into bed. And over the other side I've got my fuel pressure gauge all wrapped up nicely in a little blanket, but it's also cable tied in place nice and sturdy, and I've also been able to shut the bonnet without any of those causing an obstruction or being too close to the bonnet. So next thing is road test, and I guess take a few tools with me: test lights, multimeter, oscilloscope, dressmaking pins, a spare relay of course, and we'll see how we go with that. So the mystery thickens. I've just got back from a road test, well, sort of a road test. It broke down, had to get almost towed back here, but it started and stopped and started and stopped. And of course, now the stupid thing starts and runs. But I was able to do some testing while I was broken down on the side of the road. One of the good things that I did was hook up my fuel pressure gauge, and that went down to nothing, which was excellent. So we've got a fuel issue or a fuel pump issue. We know the injectors are working okay. My oil pressure was fine over there, no problems there. So what was the problem? Well, it was being controlled okay by the ECU, no problems there, but it had 12 volts on one side of the relay switch, and on the other side, which is meant to shut and then go off to the fuel pump, it actually had about, I don't know, 10 volts. Why would it have voltage coming back this way if it's meant to have voltage going that way and complete the circuit? I don't know what's going on. Very strange indeed. But anyway, as I put my multimeter on there, I actually watched it bleed down. And so it went from about 10 volts, 5 volts, drop down to nothing. And as soon as it did that, I was able to start the vehicle and get it back to the workshop. But look, if it still doesn't play up, it's just a pain in the neck. It's going to be a bit of an issue. So I thought I'd have a look at the fuel pump control module. Now, according to all the information I've seen, it's in the back of the vehicle. Let's go back there and have a look. According to all the information that I can find online, it's meant to be in the back of the vehicle, just off the side of the wheel well on the driver's side. Let's have a look. So as you can see, I've gutted the back of the car, and the module should be in back here somewhere. Module. I can't see it anywhere. Perhaps the wiring diagram is designed for left-hand drive. So that would make the driver's side over this side. Do you see a module in there? No, just wiring blocks. So, I don't know what's going on here. I'll have to research it further to find out what's going on. This Rav4 has really stretched my brain. Fortunately, I have a good support group that I can turn to. TAT, the automotive technician. I've put in a TAT assist form, as you can see behind me there, and they've been able to help me with various thoughts and directions to go. Some that I had thought of already, some that I hadn't. One thing I wasn't aware of was that there is a difference between the two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive wiring schematic with regard to the fuel pump system. The two-wheel drive has a fuel control module, which is what I thought this one had, but it doesn't. The four-wheel drive just has a basic relay setup, 3 relays in fact, to scoot through to get the fuel pump to work. The relay that I initially thought was correct is just the first relay in a series of relays. The relay that I need to check is actually called the circuit opening relay, and this is the 3rd relay along the path down to the fuel pump. I have checked this one under the digital microscope and found that the points are definitely a little bit worn. So I'd like to try and recreate that voltage drop that we saw before and see if that is actually the fault. Anyway, don't guess, test. The relay that I initially thought was the issue was this bloke over here, and according to the owner's manual and every other piece of wiring diagram that I read, this was the correct one to test, but I don't think it is. So you guys are now at extreme close-up. All I'm going to do is separate those points and have a listen to the engine. I can see the fuel pressure dropping down to 20 psi. It's going to stall in a sec. Hear it? Let's put some fuel back in it. Can I make it? No. Okay, let's see if it'll start again. Well, that's interesting. I haven't got any fuel pressure now. Since it's playing up right now, why don't we chuck another relay in it? See if that'll fix the fella. Let's try that one. And we have fuel pressure again. Excellent. I might just chuck that relay back in just to confirm the diagnosis. I can't get you any closer without going out of focus, but I'll show you how the relay actually works. Just have a look at these 2 points here, and I'll just release the relay up and down. You'll see the points open and shut. See the points? It's actually getting quite hot, this relay, which usually indicates that it's got a fault in the circuit. So that's reconnected again, but it's stalling out. Okay, I'll just pop that one out and stick another relay in. We'll just double check our work and see if that is actually our fault or not. Yes, that's actually quite warm. Let's chuck in a different one and see what happens now. That should bring up our fuel pressure straight away. I wonder if I just bypass that, will that bring on the fuel pump while it's playing up? What I'm going to do now is bypass the relay. I still don't have fuel pressure, but I'm just going to bypass it with a fused bridge. If that brings up fuel pressure, then we know it's still a relay fault. If not, we have to start searching further. Alright, so it's fused, so it's safe. I'm not worried about my control side of things at this point, but let's just see if we get fuel pressure. Yep, look at that. Straight away, without a doubt. We've finally got the thing sorted, I believe, or the area at least, of where the fault is. What I did was turn on the ignition with all my relays reconnected, bar the circuit opening relay. So I've actually bypassed it, as you can see over there. It's fused, but it's been bypassed. So have a look at the fuel gauge. I've run it dry on purpose. Hopefully we can get it to play up. So we'll turn on the ignition now, and hopefully it won't come up. And what I'm going to do now is just kick the fuel tank, and that, if the fuel pump is faulty, it should actually come up. So we'll have a look at the gauge while I kick the fuel tank. Can you try and start it, please? Hold it. The ignition's still turned on. Ow! Yep, see that? The gauge has now come up because I kicked the fuel tank. There's evidence there that we have a bad segment, most likely on the fuel pump itself, or a bad internal connection. Sorry, it's out of focus there, folks. So just to confirm my diagnosis, I've hooked up a current clamp here. It's just a cheapy type of current clamp, but I've now hooked it up to my oscilloscope. So the current clamp goes around that wiring bypass that I did across the relay. So we're current going through here. That goes across to my cheap little oscilloscope. But look, seriously, you couldn't ask for a better pattern for a fault. How's that sound? If that makes any sense. Have a look at the signal here. You can see that there's a segment that is faulty, at least one segment that's faulty, and that in turn is creating this stop-start situation. If we're to pause it, you can see, look at it, it's not very attractive, is it? And you can see that there's certainly a segment that's out, isn't there? There's no doubt about that whatsoever. We have a segment on our fuel pump that is definitely crook. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's a 9-segment one by the looks of things, but you can see the dropout on the bottom. Yeah, confirmed we've got a fuel pump issue, and by kicking it we're getting it past this segment, but yep, confirmed, needs another fuel pump. Here is the old fuel pump. Here is the old fuel filter assembly. And here is the newly installed pump and filter assembly together. It's ready to go back. This is called a fuel module, a fuel pump module. So it's ready to go back into the tank and then back into the vehicle. So the module's chucked back in the tank, and the tank's now ready to get stuck up under the vehicle. So the tank's in, and I've just turned the ignition switch, and yes, we have pressure. Very, very good. But what does the oscilloscope say the pattern should look like? Well, we know what it should look like, and we know what it shouldn't look like, but what do we have? Let's have a look. So that, people, is a consistent waveform. Wouldn't you agree? Have a look at it. There's no hiccups, there's no high points and low points. They're all very, very consistent. That is an excellent fuel pump. That's exactly the waveform that we should be looking for. And even if we change the time base and voltage, we're still seeing a consistent waveform. We're not seeing any huge dropouts that we saw before, and it's nice and consistent. I'm happy with that. Just so that you don't get caught out, guys, it almost caught me out. The fuel gauge was reading dead empty and the little light was on, and hey, I know I put in like, I don't know, 60 litres, something along those lines, 50, 60 litres, and I thought, hang on a sec, perhaps I haven't hooked up the fuel gauge sender unit correctly, because that's on a separate wire compared to the fuel pump. So I've just lowered the tank just a smidge to get my hand up the top there. No, I had done the correct thing, it was wired correctly. So what was the issue? It's always important when you fiddle around with stuff that you clear codes that you have created. And there was loads of them. There was 6 in the engine, there was, I don't know, about 3 in the body, 1 in the air conditioning. A lot of it was communication issues. So I've been able to clear those out, and yes, my fuel gauge came back. So she's happy, mate. Everything's going good at the moment. Just something to be aware of: if the fuel gauge is not working and you've done some work under the bonnet, reset your codes or clear your codes, the ones that you have created, and that may bring back your instrument cluster, etc., including the fuel gauge. I've just spent the last hour or so road testing this here vehicle. I took it around the block about 4 or 5 times, so I was close to the workshop in case it broke down. It worked flawlessly. So I took it out the road and gave it a thorough road test, a good hard one, should I say. And it went flawlessly there as well. About 30 something Ks just out there then back again, and no problems whatsoever. It was quite interesting to see the waveform of the faulty fuel pump in comparison to the waveform of the good fuel pump, a clear indication that a correct diagnosis had been made. Guys, this was an interesting diagnosis and repair, and I hope you got something from it. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Give it a like and feel free to comment down below. And hey, don't forget about that notification bell. You don't want to miss any future videos. So until next time, guys, this is MiracleMAX signing off. I will catch you later.